Joining me now is Dr. Solomon David from the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago. Solomon, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Christy.
All right, I think every picture that I've ever seen of you, you're holding a fish. And you have to tell me where you started your passion.
It's yeah, a lot of the pictures with fish. So
with fish,
clearly
yes.
it started a long time ago and is still persisting to this day. I would say, I actually was born out in Washington State, and so it was when my dad would take me to the Stillaguamish River out there, and so that was sort of my first connection with the water out there, and that's a major nexus. Those two branches are where a lot of steelhead and Chinook salmon move back and forth to spawn and out-migrate. And so move forward to where I'm at now in Chicago, studying Great Lakes fishes. I'm still looking a little bit into the salmon, but also some of the native fisheries too. And so it's been going on, since back then. That early connection to the water has sort of just moved forward through time, and I've had the privilege of working on, what I'm passionate about.
All right, so we would probably see like a 5-year-old Solomon holding a fish if we look back that
Exactly,
far.
yeah.
All right, so talk to us a little bit about the work that you're doing at Shedd right now, looking at migratory fishes in the Great Lakes and the importance of how they're affected by any kind of, change with habitat loss or invasive species. Talk a little bit about your work.
Sure. So my position at Shedd is I'm a Postdoctoral Research Associate there. So the more understandable version of that is that I'm a fish ecologist, so I study how fish interact with their environment. More specifically than that, I study Great Lakes migratory fish. So those fish that move back and forth through those diverse habitats that Patrick mentioned in this sort of very diverse ecosystem. Great Lakes migratory fishes move through the Great Lakes proper, into the streams, into the wetlands, and into the rivers, and sometimes back again. And as they make those migrations, they can actually serve as environmental checkpoints and therefore tell us a little bit about ecosystem health. So we've got some specific projects, and I'm working with University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm co-supervised by that group as well. So we've got great opportunities to work on different projects. One of our main projects is looking at the reemergence of lake whitefish migrations, which is one of the most important commercial fisheries in the Great Lakes.
What are we talking about in terms of numbers?
In terms of numbers, we're looking at a slow start. So up until about 100 years ago, lake whitefish would move into tributaries from the lake and spawn much like salmon do. But then after a while, because of sawmill pollution and habitat loss, they ceased those migrations. And then over time, over the past maybe 5 to 10 years, it started with anglers and eventually fishery managers started noticing those fish were starting to move back into the rivers again. And so one of our projects is to look at why are those fish coming back, and can we learn more about the health of the overall ecosystem by looking at those migrations. So I think it's a great story of a native fishery that was impacted by pollution, by invasive species, and is now starting to make a comeback.
Why is it so important that we concentrate on having our native fish in the Great Lakes as opposed to saying, well, some of our non-native species, we should just let them kind of take over?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to note, too, that a lot of these invasive species will never actually get rid of them. We can manage for them now, so it's important to keep other ones out. On the flip side of that, it's important to have our native species there because when we have that biodiversity, it gives you sort of a structural integrity of the ecosystem where you can hopefully be more resistant to invasions if our native fishes are doing well. So if we can restore that habitat, we might make it more habitable for the native fishes, maybe those that were impacted or those that might have been lost, to make a comeback and therefore be more resistant to invasive species.
All right, so now you're starting to talk about restoration a little bit, which I can only assume is a very, very large project with a lot of different moving parts. So talk to me about some of the restoration projects that you're working on right now.
One of the other key projects we're looking at is dam removal and associated wetland restoration. So we're looking at the focal species of northern pike up in the Green Bay area, working with University of Wisconsin Green Bay. And so a lot of the migratory pike there actually move through agricultural ditches up through alongside the road, essentially, up into wetlands, and then they spawn there and they move back out. So we're looking at, can we restore those habitats that might have been impacted by agriculture, by that sort of effluent, and also by dams. So we're looking to sort of remove those barriers to migration to improve those fish habitats and also the populations.
This sounds like a great project, but are there limitations that you face when you're working on a restoration project like that?
There can be limitations when you pave the road, not necessarily literally, for fish to make their way into new habitats. You do allow some of these other species in too. So we might get native species like northern pike, like yellow perch, like walleye, but unfortunately we still have the common carp hanging around. So they might try to take advantage of those same types of habitats. So it's important to give the best chance to our native fishes, to give them the first shot at this habitat, and therefore that habitat might be more robust and more resilient resist invasion.
Okay, so who do you work with in terms of other agencies, and are you have partners in restoration that you're kind of working together at making sure that you're not covering some of the same ground?
Sure, it's a huge collaborative effort. I'm one person out of Shedd, and we've got a great team coming out of there. But again, University of Wisconsin-Madison, they've got grad students and researchers working with us. The DNR, also USGS, so great partners like Randy and Maureen's agencies. It's a very collaborative effort. So I think without that collaboration, we wouldn't be able to carry out these projects.
All right, so how do we make sure, though, that our fisheries are diverse in the Great Lakes?
How do we make sure? I think, again, as Randy had stated, if we can make sure that the habitat is there. If you have the high quality habitat, the fish will come. And I think that's a great indicator to us if we're doing a good job, if you will, because the fish won't show up unless the habitat is good. So seeing those whitefish coming back to places like the Fox River, which was an area of concern, one of the most polluted areas in the Great Lakes, now you've got this relatively picky fish coming back there, and that's a good indication that that sort of restoration, that sort of cleanup is having an impact.
I would think, though, sometimes we can be really impatient when we talk about, let's make sure that this gets done, and are we going to see a difference in 6 months? When you talk to people about these sorts of efforts and you say, well, hopefully fish will come back, what kind of timeline do we look at?
That can be a bit of a challenge. So some fish take a little bit longer to realize that the habitat is there. Other fish respond a little bit quicker. With some of the yellow perch and the walleye, we're seeing them coming back to some of these habitats that were previously blocked off from dams within a year or so. Other areas, like in the Chicago area waterway system, we're noticing fish that were tended to be picky, some types of minnows and suckers. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention they found a spotted gar there as well.
How did you know that was the next thing on my question list?
So these native fishes can be environmental indicators, and when they're back, that's it means we're doing a good job.
Okay, so Solomon was talking about the spotted gar, and again, if you go online, you will see a picture of him holding the spotted gar that you found coming through the Chicago area waterway system. So tell us what was so significant about that.
So first of all, it was our partners, Illinois DNR, that had found it, but they sent pictures to us at Shedd, and I get a lot of gar pictures coming through, mainly because I'm looking for them anyway.
Why?
And
you studied them, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I did my dissertation work at University of Michigan, go Blue.
Did I tell you I graduated from state?
Exactly.
Is this something we're going to have to talk about?
Is great here.
I'm sorry, again, about the gar. You did your dissertation on that fish, so significant.
It was a model species, and it showed that Great Lakes fishes are resilient. Great Lakes fishes are actually unique. They have unique adaptations to this sort of frontier habitat in some cases. The Great Lakes are unique. They're very different from the rest of the country, the rest of the world. And that Chicago area fish, they tend to be pretty picky. So finding that one spotted gar, it could mean something, it could mean nothing. It's sort of a wanderer, and so if we find more, it'll be a better indication of maybe overall habitat improvements. But that fish probably wouldn't have been there if the habitat hadn't improved, if the water or the vegetation hadn't been improved for that. And if we get fish like that coming back, we might get other fish like your perch or walleye and other game fish too.
Do you ever give yourself a time frame and say, look, if we see another spotted gar within the next 6 months, we know that that means X?
I'd say that would be leading us in the right direction. Finding one is great, but I think you need to find more. And that's the same way with the whitefish. It's the same way finding pike. It's the same way finding walleye using habitat that a dam had previously blocked off.
All right. Now, obviously, this is not my area of expertise, which is why I'm so glad to be able to talk to someone like you who obviously have so much passion and so much knowledge. Do you find that people who live in the Great Lakes Basin do have a connection to the fisheries and are starting to learn a little bit more about what's happening under the water?
I think so. I think people are excited to find out what's out there essentially in their backyard. I think the Great Lakes can be a bit of a black box when you think about the deep water habitats. One of the things that we have at Shedd Aquarium is that sort of accessibility, that outreach that connects the public with what is going on beneath the surface there. So they're sort of connected to that Great Lakes living world, seeing the fish like the burbot that they may not see that lives in these sort of deep water reefs. It's, quote unquote, an ugly fish. I tend to like the ugly fish. But again, the public can see those fish and hopefully connect it with them better and inspire them to make that sort of difference, whether that's citizen science, learning about better choices with seafood and consumption, or more sustainable practices in general.
All right, so what are the top questions that you get from people when you're interacting with them out at Shedd?
At Shedd, wow, it's usually, where did this fish come from? Sometimes it's what is this fish's name, those sorts of things. But I think it's an opportunity to tell them, this fish actually came from right out there in Lake Michigan. So it's kind of neat to show them that these species species are found in the Great Lakes, essentially in your backyard. There's much to be said for the exotic species that are found throughout the world, but I think people, whether you're in Chicago, in Green Bay, in Cleveland, are interested in what's going on right outside their doors because that's where they live. They're interfacing directly with that habitat, that environment, so it's important to know.
So what do you think that we should be teaching our next generation, our younger kids coming up?
I think definitely to pay attention, to what's going on out there. Get involved, learn more about these ecosystems, learn more about the diversity of these ecosystems and why biodiversity is important and why it's important to make sort of sustainable choices, your water usage and where your food comes from. There's a lot of different things, but I think educating yourself about this is very important.
All right, Dr. Solomon David, thanks so much for joining us from Shedd Aquarium. We appreciate it.
Thank you.